So as of a few days ago, I have finished the Silent Hill 2 remake, and as such I had to make at least one video on it. Now full disclosure, I played through on the PS5 because, well frankly it just felt right to play it there, but apparently it doesn't do too shabby on the Steam Deck either, though I just haven't had a chance to test it there yet. So today I just wanted to give my thoughts on the Silent Hill 2 remake as someone who's been playing the original for just about a quarter century at this point. But before we begin, know that I will not be overtly spoiling any major plot points. And in the interest of preserving the experience for new and veteran players alike, I'll be sticking to mostly early and mid-game locales, and in any instances where I show a cutscene, I'll be sure to censor the on-screen text if necessary to keep from spoiling any major revelations. And with that light housekeeping out of the way, let's dive in. When I first played the original Silent Hill 2, I was a teenager and had only been playing PlayStation games for a couple of years. I grew up a Nintendo kid, and while I swore to my friends that the N64 was just as good as the PlayStation because it even got a port of Resident Evil 2, deep down I knew the PlayStation was going to win me over sooner rather than later. And a relatively obscure title at the time, Silent Hill, was the game that pushed me over the edge. It was dark, grimy, and rather than emphasizing B-movie camp like its Resident Evil counterpart, Silent Hill was all about dark forces, the occult, and extremely cerebral by comparison. Initially I only dove into Silent Hill because I wanted to see what all the fuss was about, and just wanted to prove to myself that I was able to see it through to the credits. And after I did, it started to click for me why this game was so special. In the following 2 years, I found myself, along with 2 close friends who had introduced me to it, also anxiously awaiting its follow-up, Silent Hill 2. And when it finally arrived, I couldn't have been more thrilled with it. For starters, it was a near complete departure from the original. It didn't continue Harry Mason's story, but rather focused on newcomer James Sunderland, a broken, grieving man grasping at desperate hope that his dead wife might really be waiting for him in the town of Silent Hill. What followed in that adventure would solidify Silent Hill 2 as not just a legendary horror game, but by many accounts the greatest horror game ever made. And while it shifted focus from the occult elements of the first outing to a deeply personal story of loss and pain, what really made it shine was its fearlessness in tackling darker themes. Exploring more grounded horrors like depression, anxiety, sexual assault, guilt, grief, trauma, redemption, and just coming to grips with your own mortality. Essentially turning a mirror on the human condition. But it's not just that these things are present in the game, but also that they are handled with incredible care. When you're treading into the waters of something as controversial or unsettling as self-harm, there's something to be said for carefully considering how you're going to convey that. What might be an abstract concept to some players might hit a little too close to home for others, dredging up painful memories. Or more to the point, Silent Hill 2 wasn't great just because it included these themes, but rather because it definitely avoided handling any of them in a ham-fisted way. All of this is to say that Silent Hill 2 is so much more than a haunted house simulator. Is it scary? Undeniably. But it's made memorable not because it presents a parade of jump scares, rather the suffocating dread woven throughout the town, coupled with these very relatable human struggles, keeps it stuck in your mind long after you've rolled credits. How long after you've rolled credits? Well, for me it's been a little over 23 years since that first run. Granted, in the years that followed, I'd periodically jump back in and revisit the town of Silent Hill 2 just because I love being there, but also because it's gone through multiple iterations before the full-blown 2024 remake manifested. You could always play on the OG PS2 hardware if you happen to have kept a copy for that long, or didn't mind paying exorbitant prices on the secondhand market. You could play the Xbox version, which included the Born from a Wish scenario. Then there's the PC version, which initially was a little bit iffy from a performance standpoint. But then it would quickly go on to become the de facto way to play the original thanks to the tireless work of the folks behind the Enhanced Edition mod. And finally, if you really wanted to slum it, you could play the HD collection on PS3 or modern Xbox consoles, which had its own suite of problems that are way outside the scope of this video. But now, in 2024, we have the Silent Hill 2 remake, which is a different beast entirely.
You sure?
Well, I shouldn't say entirely. The cast of characters and enemy roster is largely the same, and we're still in Silent Hill itself, skulking through fog-laden streets, piecing together obscure clues, and solving puzzles along the way. All while trying to stay alive, of course. But this time around there's more than just a fresh coat of modern 4K paint, though that's probably the best place to start because the town of Silent Hill is the character unto itself, and if the presentation of the town doesn't work, then the whole game doesn't work, or at least not nearly as effectively. The most obvious improvement is the updated visuals. By sheer virtue of the technological gap between the early aughts and 2024, the town was almost certainly going to be a marked improvement. As of 2020, we're 3 console generations removed from the PlayStation 2, and it definitely shows.
In my restless dreams,
I see that town. Silent Hill.
Crisp, detailed textures abound, and the interplay between light and shadow is more pronounced than ever, making even the faintest light a source of welcome sanctuary in Silent Hill 2's darkest moments. Wind kicks up and dies down dynamically, causing leaves and debris to rustle realistically through the streets. The fog will rest gently ahead, at best obscuring your view, or at worst completely disorienting you as you try to get your bearings. Sometimes it's peaceful and almost comforting, but combined with the wind, it can become almost hungry, furiously lashing at your heels as you desperately seek shelter from threats closing in on all sides. Historically, the fog of Silent Hill has served a dual role of sorts. On the one hand, it was a practical means of masking the rendering limitations of the era, but it also had the atmospheric benefit of encapsulating the player in a hazy, dreamlike environment, one that served up moments of calm serenity as much as uneasiness. But in 2024, it can be used exclusively for shaping the feel of the town and its sequences, and Bloober has done so with exacting precision, allowing players to experience the heaviness of Silent Hill more vividly than ever before. Beyond the town itself, the characters too have almost been completely overhauled with new models, mocap performances, and modified or expanded dialogue. Clearly comparing 2024 James with 2001 James shows massive gains in fidelity, even if you were to compare the in-game model of today against the pre-rendered cutscenes of yesteryear. But where these updated models really shine is in the nuance. Even the most subtle facial animations by the actors is captured in a way that lends every scene that extra oomph that really pushes it over the edge. Every fleeting moment of regret, doubt, or apprehension lands with a satisfying weight. That's as much a testament to technological advancement as it is the performances by the actors. Speaking of, while it might seem like heresy to modify any of the dialogue, I can assure you that every modified line or expanded monologue either retains the spirit of the original vision or even elevates it. But let's put aside the visuals and general polish for a bit and look at the gameplay itself. Throughout your journey into the town, your activities will predominantly slot into exploration, solving puzzles, or squaring off against a variety of horrors, some of these new and some of them reimagined to fit the flow of combat. And that combat is, well, it's interesting. James isn't ex-Special Forces or anything, rather he's just a guy, so it wouldn't be congruent with his character to expect some snake-level CQC takedowns whenever you're forced to fight. That being said, this version of James is far more capable than the 2001 version. You can duck and weave, and with a bit of practice, you can absolutely decimate a lot of the low-level foes once you get a feel for the rhythm. But that shouldn't suggest you're unstoppable. If you can isolate your foes, you're likely to hold your own, but even tackling just 2 at a time, especially in cramped quarters, can make every fight feel like a desperate struggle, which is exactly as it should be. And while I always felt that Silent Hill was more psychological horror than survival horror given the avalanche of resources it throws at you relative to games like Resident Evil, make no mistake, it will definitely test your abilities. When you're not going toe-to-toe with low-level scrubs, you'll be forced into a variety of boss battles as well, and each one of these has been tweaked at least a little bit to be louder, more engaging, and more surprising than the original. None of these are insurmountable or anything, but they are challenging enough to keep you on the defensive, particularly at higher combat difficulties. In fact, I'm a little ashamed to say that I charged into some early fights with the naive arrogance of a 20-year veteran, and in turn I was quickly put on the back foot and completely surprised that an enemy with no arms definitely had hands. Thankfully, Silent Hill 2 is still mostly well-paced, and Bloober have done a good job of interspersing action-heavy set-pieces with quieter moments of exploration. Well, thematically quieter anyways. In a literal sense, the exploratory portions of the town and its interior environments are as tense and unnerving as ever, complete with a few new tricks. Just like the original, your flashlight and radio are your only real barometers for danger, and even those are intermittently unreliable. On more than one occasion, I'd be inching my way down some empty hallway, only to be ambushed by an enemy lying in wait, sometimes literally, whose presence didn't trigger my radio until it was already too late. Other times I'd enter a room with no danger at all, but the heaviness of the atmosphere, like groaning floorboards or the muffled distant sounds of scraping metal, kept me on edge. Taking exploration a step further are some improved traversal elements. Sometimes James must squeeze through not just tight spaces directly in front of him, but also crawl through narrow openings on the floor or reposition platforms to leap up and crawl through an open window. It's a small change to be sure, but it goes a long way towards making some of the town's most iconic locations feel even more labyrinthian. Sometimes these are obvious, but even with the light-handed guide of white strips of cloth that help them stand out, they can be missed given the oppressive darkness of most of the buildings you'll explore. And I can't overstate how thankful I am that they didn't go with the industry standard yellow paint denoting where you should go next, because Silent Hill really needs to stay at least a little bit perplexing, even if they're trying to appeal to new and veteran players alike. Speaking of, just like the original, they've retained the option to raise or lower the puzzle difficulty as well. I left it at standard for the first run, and while I was able to feel my way through without too much hindrance, they've remixed things just enough to keep experienced players guessing as well. Most of the original puzzles are intact, with some variations to throw you off the scent, but there are also some incredibly clever new puzzles that feel as though they've always been there. And that honestly is a pretty good summation of the experience as a whole. Silent Hill 2 Remake is so subtle in its deviations and liberties that it sort of blurs the line between your memory of the original and the steps that you're retracing as this updated version of James. It succeeds not just because it gives players more of the same, but because, despite all odds, the developers have perfectly threaded that needle of making Silent Hill feel fresh without having to gut it entirely. Figurative and literal remnants of the original are littered throughout the town. Some of these are subtle nods that only diehards are likely to recognize, but others are more overt, in-your-face, quieter moments known as glimpses of the past. These will have James pause for a moment and reflect on a location that held great significance in the original, but otherwise might be mistaken as general set dressing to the uninitiated. But don't worry, if you're a complete newcomer to Silent Hill, or at least Silent Hill 2, there's nothing so significant in the callbacks that you'll feel lost or unable to appreciate it as a new player. In fact, I'm incredibly jealous of new players that have remained unspoiled precisely because they can experience what is effectively a perfect and expanded retelling of the original, just with better visuals than I could have dreamt of when I was a teenager. Now, I've spent most of this video talking about all the things that work in Silent Hill 2, and really there's not a lot that I take umbrage with here. However, I did want to point out at least a couple of things that did give me a bit of pause. And this feedback's going to sound a little bit silly, but I couldn't not bring it up, and one of the first things is that Silent Hill 2 is almost too effective in its atmosphere. I know that sounds like responding to an interview question about your weaknesses by saying, oh, I'm just too dedicated to my work, but let me expand on that a little bit. I went into Silent Hill 2 both excited and confident. After all, this clearly isn't my first rodeo with Silent Hill or horror games in general. Plus, as a longtime fan of the original, even with a few surprises, I was pretty sure how most of the story beats, locales, puzzles, and fights would ultimately play out. And I was mostly right in that regard. But what I did not expect was just how suffocating the leap to the 9th console generation would be. And that's for a couple of different reasons. One, the visuals combined with an entirely new level of surround sound make every new environment completely oppressive. But beyond that, enemies are craftier than they've ever been as well. So every trek down a long dark hallway feels threatening as you could be ambushed at any moment. Plus, it could be my imagination, but it also seems like enemies are willing to follow you further than before and are more aggressive in their pursuit. On more than one occasion, I foolishly thought that ducking into a nearby door would keep me safe, only to have some random nurse come lumbering in to correct me. And all of this, the never-ending stream of horrors, the distant wails, the sudden influx of deafening silence, and just overall hopelessness carried out by its principal cast can absolutely wear on you. Where I could marathon the original Silent Hill 2 and play for hours at a time, in the remake I found myself coming up for air every hour or so just for a break from the heaviness. At least until I got to maybe the last few hours when the finish line was in sight, which brings me to the second major criticism that I'm honestly a little bit split on at the moment, and that would be the pacing. I mentioned earlier that it was mostly preserved, and that's true in so much as Bloober knows when to go full throttle on the scares, and when to ease off a bit to give the player a break. But there's no denying this is a much longer game than the original. You can knock out the original Silent Hill 2 in about 8 hours if you're a skilled player, and maybe 10 to 12 if you're new to the genre or just want to stop and smell the roses. But here you're looking at least 15 hours in all likelihood, and I, as someone who does like stopping to smell the roses, clocked in at just under 24 hours of playtime. Granted, not everyone will care to go over it with a fine-tooth comb or anything, but still, it's a beefy boy. And that's not bad necessarily, but it might be a little bit intimidating if you were planning on a second playthrough just to try for a different ending. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed every minute of my time here, but it definitely took a little longer than I was expecting, and it made me wonder if that hit to the pacing would be off-putting for newcomers. Ultimately, I wouldn't call it egregious, but it is noticeable, particularly at the outset where it now takes 1 to 2 hours to get to what you would call the first dungeon, where the same could be accomplished in about 15 minutes in the original. And I understand why they did this. Games are bigger and louder than they've ever been, and with a price to match. And love it or hate it, how many hours of gameplay you get for the current AAA pricing standard of $70 really matters to a lot of would-be players. But thankfully, all of the new content and expanded environments feel perfectly Silent Hill 2 rather than fluff for the sake of padding the runtime. For all of the newness present in this incarnation of Silent Hill 2, Bloober has wisely and respectfully acknowledged these changes. It's no secret that there was a lot of apprehension, if not outright hatred, being slung in their direction when it was announced that they'd be helming the remake. And no one would be looking at this game more critically than series veterans who were there in the beginning or grew up alongside the Silent Hill series. Making this an even more Herculean task is that everyone is going to have a different idea about what should stay, be cut, or reworked. But I can confidently say as one of those old school snobs that Bloober has absolutely nailed it here. And I love that despite, or probably because of the outrageous pressure they no doubt endured from Konami and fans alike, that their passion for the source material is completely realized here. So whether you're new to the fog or, like me, find Silent Hill to be the video game equivalent of your favorite hoodie, you absolutely shouldn't miss the Silent Hill 2 remake. Alright, and that's it for this one. I can't say whether or not I will do any more Silent Hill 2 videos, but I've definitely had an amazing time with this game. It's just been a real treat, and I'm having, even more fun going through it on New Game Plus. So, all that being said, as far as what's coming up on the channel, I should be doing some games coming out in November. Might still be able to squeeze in those scary games, even though I did get sick for a week there, which is unfortunate, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on the Silent Hill 2 remake. I would love to know if you're playing through it yourself, or if you plan to check it out, if you're, either new to the game entirely, or if you are an old school fan like myself. I would love to hear what you think of it. As always, thank you so much for your time and hanging out here on the channel. Have an amazing day, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.